Between two ancient rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, lies a landscape where history itself began to breathe. The land was neither entirely desert nor entirely fertile. It was a shifting mosaic of mudflats, reeds, and silt. Every year, the rivers swelled with the spring melt from the distant mountains, spilling across the plains, leaving behind a skin of fertile soil and destruction in equal measure. Here, humanity's first cities would one day rise. But at the dawn of this story, there were only small groups of wanderers, people who followed the rhythm of the rivers, unaware that they were walking across the threshold of civilization. The Tigris, fast and temperamental, and the Euphrates, broad and meandering, defined not just geography, but destiny. Their floods were unpredictable, capable of both nurturing and erasing entire settlements. Yet, the land between them offered what no other region could, the perfect balance of danger and opportunity. It was this delicate tension between fear and abundance that taught humans to adapt, to plan, and eventually, to rule nature itself. Few could imagine that from these muddy banks would rise the first organized societies, the first temples, the first written words. In these early millennia, around 6000 BCE, life was measured not by kingdoms or dynasties, but by harvests. Families lived in reed huts, shaped by the same material that surrounded them. Their days were filled with the rhythm of irrigation and the steady hum of nature. Every act, from planting to prayer, was an answer to the river's moods. Slowly, humanity learned to shape the water's path, carving small canals that carried life deeper into the plains. Each narrow ditch and each channel dug by hand marked the beginning of a transformation so vast it would redefine the human story. Meanwhile, the land itself changed. Marshes turned into villages, villages into towns. The rivers no longer flowed freely. They were guided, disciplined by human design. The people of this region, though nameless to us now, were the first to realize that cooperation could defy chaos. They learned that unity could turn survival into progress. And so, before any empire or monument existed, a quiet revolution had begun, the invention of control. As centuries passed, small communities appeared along the southern plain, where the rivers met the Gulf. These were the earliest hints of what would become the Sumerian world. The people cultivated barley, raised cattle, and baked clay into pottery. They discovered that the earth beneath their feet, humble mud, could be shaped, fired, and hardened into vessels that lasted beyond a lifetime. With that discovery came permanence. Humanity was no longer passing through the landscape. It was settling in. From this foundation emerged what historians call the Ubaid period, a long and patient prelude to civilization. Between 5500 and 4000 BCE, the Ubaid people laid the groundwork for what the Sumerians would later perfect. They built large communal houses with storage rooms and shared courtyards. Their pottery carried geometric designs that spoke of rhythm and discipline. There was no single ruler, no city-state, only a quiet sense of order, a cooperation born of necessity. The river could not be tamed by one family alone. It demanded the labor of many. And in that collective effort, the idea of society was born. It was during this time that the first religious symbols appeared. Simple altars stood in the center of villages, where offerings of grain and milk were left for unseen powers. The people had begun to see divinity in the forces that governed their lives: the river, the sun, the fertile earth. Faith emerged not from fear, but from gratitude and awe. The divine was everywhere, as constant as the wind that swept across the plains. Each harvest became an act of worship, each flood a dialogue between man and the gods. As centuries unfolded, these early settlements grew more organized. The Halaf and Hassuna cultures in the north mirrored the same evolution, with painted pottery and early signs of trade. Clay tokens began to circulate, small, simple counters used to record exchanges of goods. They were the first whispers of what would one day become writing. It was a subtle shift, from memory to record, from moment to permanence. Without knowing it, these early people were building the infrastructure of history. What began as modest villages eventually expanded into towns. Around 4500 BCE, one of these small settlements, Eridu, rose near the southern marshes. To later generations, Eridu would be remembered as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Archaeologists have uncovered layer upon layer of temples built atop one another, each one grander than the last. The earliest were made of simple mud brick. Later ones stood on raised platforms, precursors to the mighty ziggurats that would one day pierce the Mesopotamian sky. But in its earliest days, Eridu was still small, perhaps home to just a few hundred souls. Its temple stood at the heart of the community, dedicated to Enki, the god of water and wisdom. It was a fitting choice, for in this world, water was both giver and taker of life. The priests who tended Enki's shrine became more than spiritual guides. They were also the keepers of knowledge, of seasons, floods, and the flow of trade. Religion and administration were becoming one, woven together by necessity. Across the plains, other towns followed Eridu's example. Ur, Lagash, and Kish, each with its own deity, its own pride. Yet these were not yet rivals. They were siblings born of the same river's will. Together, they formed a web of human cooperation that spanned hundreds of miles. Paths worn by traders linked them, carrying fish from the marshes, grain from the fields, and copper from distant lands. Slowly, wealth accumulated. With it came artisans, potters, and builders. The simple reed huts of the past gave way to multi-roomed homes and organized streets. It was during this transformation that another quiet revelation occurred. The human sense of time expanded. Villagers began to measure not just seasons, but generations. Clay tablets marked offerings and harvests. Temples preserved the memory of those who served them. The concept of ancestry, of belonging to something larger than one's own life, took root. Civilization was no longer an accident of survival, it was an inheritance. As populations grew, so too did complexity. The need to manage irrigation, food distribution, and construction demanded leaders, not kings yet, and overseers. These early administrators balanced practical knowledge with spiritual authority. In their dual role, we see the seed of what would later become divine kingship. They were mediators between the human and the divine, between the unpredictable world and the order that people longed for. Meanwhile, the rivers continued their ancient rhythm. Each flood erased and renewed in equal measure. When the waters receded, people returned to rebuild. Over centuries, this cycle became the pulse of Sumerian identity, resilience born from destruction. They learned that stability was not the absence of change, but the mastery of it. It was this understanding, forged in mud and flood, that would allow them to create the first enduring civilization on Earth. By around 4000 BCE, the once quiet towns had become unmistakably urban. Streets intersected at right angles, granaries stored surplus grain, and craftsmen specialized in trades. Pottery workshops, metalworkers, and weavers formed the first organized economies. The humble clay, which once served as a vessel, now became a canvas of innovation. On it were carved not just symbols of trade, but symbols of thought. At the heart of this growing complexity stood Uruk, a settlement destined to become legend. Rising from the flat horizon, its temples and walls marked the first skyline in human history. The sheer scale of Uruk, with tens of thousands of inhabitants, was unprecedented. Here, human ambition had finally taken physical form. The temple precincts served as centers of production and distribution, while the priests and administrators developed systems of accounting that would soon evolve into cuneiform writing. The world had crossed an invisible line, from prehistory into history. The rise of Uruk also revealed something deeper about human nature. With surplus came inequality. Some directed, others obeyed. The harmony of small villages gave way to hierarchy, yet this shift was not purely political, it was also philosophical. People began to see themselves as part of something vast and ordered. The city became a symbol of human potential, a reflection of divine structure on earth. To live in a city was to live in imitation of the gods, organized, creative, and enduring. Still, beneath this triumph, there remained humility. The people of Sumer never saw themselves as masters of nature. To them, humanity was a participant in a cosmic order far greater than itself. Every brick laid, every canal dug, was a dialogue with forces beyond their control. Their achievements were monumental, but their worldview remained deeply spiritual. In that balance between innovation and reverence lay the true genius of Sumer. As we look back on this age, we see the first outlines of everything that defines civilization: cities, laws, art, and belief. Yet all of it began not with conquest or command, but with survival, cooperation, but faith in the river's rhythm. The Sumerians would later record their origins in myth, saying that their kingship descended from heaven. But in truth, it rose from the soil, from the sweat and patience of those who first shaped the mud between two rivers into meaning. The cradle of the two rivers was not just the birthplace of Sumer. It was the birth of the human idea that life could be built, shaped, and remembered. The story of civilization had begun quietly, with water, clay, and will. And as the first temples rose above the floodplain, shimmering in the dawn light, a new chapter in human history was about to unfold, an age where gods would walk beside men, and cities would become sacred mirrors of the heavens. From the mud-brick villages and the whisper of rivers, faith would rise into stone. In the coming age, temples would touch the sky, and the divine would find a home on earth. Thus began the age of the gods and temples, the sacred heart of Sumer, in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Where fertile soil met the unpredictable will of the rivers, the Sumerians built more than cities. They built connections between earth and sky. To them, life was not divided between sacred and mundane. The divine was not distant. It breathed through every harvest, every flood, every grain of barley pressed into their palms. In Sumer, the gods were not abstract ideas. They were neighbors. The earliest temples, small and unassuming, rose from the flat plains of Eridu and Uruk as simple mud-brick shrines. These were humble beginnings, yet they marked a profound shift in human thought, the belief that the world was governed by unseen powers, and that humanity could reach them through structure, ritual, and devotion. As generations passed, these temples grew in scale and meaning, transforming into monumental platforms, the ziggurats. The ziggurat was not merely an architectural wonder. It was a statement of faith carved into the skyline. Step by step, its terraces ascended toward the heavens, symbolizing a bridge between gods and mortals. Each level represented a world: the earth below, the sky above, and the divine realm beyond reach. From afar, the ziggurat gleamed like a mountain of baked clay, its summit crowned with a sanctuary where priests performed rituals at dawn and dusk. Smoke from burning offerings rose into the wind, carrying with it prayers for good harvests, for rain, for mercy. But beneath this piety lay an intricate system of power. Temples were not only places of worship, they were the beating hearts of Sumerian economy and governance. Within their walls, scribes recorded grain deliveries on clay tablets, merchants negotiated contracts under the gaze of statues, and workers received rations stamped with the temple's seal. The priests, intermediaries between gods and men, managed vast estates, overseeing herds, fields, and workshops. In this way, faith and function intertwined. Religion became administration, devotion became economy. Each city had its patron deity: Inanna of Uruk, Enki of Eridu, Nanna of Uar, Anu of the heavens. These gods embodied natural forces and human virtues alike: fertility, wisdom, justice, and love. The people saw themselves as servants in the divine household, their duty to maintain order in a world that teetered on chaos. Every offering, every prayer, was a thread in the cosmic balance. To neglect the gods was to invite disaster, drought, plague, or invasion. And yet, there was beauty in this devotion. The hymns of Sumer were among the earliest poems ever written, inscribed in cuneiform on soft clay. They spoke of longing and reverence, of gods who loved, quarreled, and wept. In these verses, humanity found a mirror of itself, frail yet enduring, mortal yet reaching for eternity. To listen to a temple singer in ancient Uruk was to glimpse the first music of civilization, echoing through the courtyards as the sun bled gold across the horizon. What makes the ziggurat so haunting even now is not its age or its scale, but its purpose. It was the first great human attempt to ascend, not in conquest, but in connection. While later empires would build pyramids to entomb kings, the Sumerians built mountains for their gods to descend. Every brick, molded by hand, bore the fingerprint of belief. It was faith made tangible. Archaeologists today, standing amid the ruins of Ur's ziggurat, still sense that silent dialogue between heaven and earth. The steps, worn and fractured, once carried priests draped in linen robes, holding incense and sacred water. The base, now eroded, once supported a bustling complex of storage rooms, kitchens, and workshops. Life revolved around the temple as planets circle a star. And in this orbit, humanity began to understand something profound, that order, beauty, and devotion could coexist within walls of clay. The revelation of Sumer was not just the invention of religion, but its unification with life itself. The temple was the center of both soul and society, a design so effective that echoes of it still shape the modern world. From cathedrals to mosques, from bureaucracies to city halls, the legacy of the ziggurat endures, a place where the human need to organize meets the eternal desire to believe. As the towers of faith rose higher, so too did human ambition. The priests who once served the gods began to advise the rulers who claimed their favor. Power and piety grew inseparable, and from the sacred heart of the ziggurat would soon emerge something new: kings. When the gods retreated to the heavens, they left behind more than myths. They left a question: who would keep order on earth? In the ancient Sumerian imagination, the answer descended like rain from the divine realm: kingship. It was not seized or inherited in their earliest stories, it was bestowed. The first ruler was not simply a man of strength or wealth. He was believed to carry a fragment of divine will, chosen to guide humanity in the god's absence. The earliest city to bear this sacred trust was Eridu, a settlement said to be the first city created upon the waters. Its name rippled through the tablets as the cradle of kingship, where the world's first ruler, Alulum, took the throne. To the Sumerians, Alulum was more than historical. He was mythic. He reigned for 28,000 years, a number not meant to be believed literally, but revered symbolically. It represented a time when the boundary between God and man was porous, when kings walked in temples still heavy with divine breath. Eridu's kings were keepers of order, but they were also dreamers. Their temples to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters, reflected a philosophy that power should be balanced with knowledge. The early ruler's task was not only to govern bodies but to nurture the spirit of the city, to ensure the gods remained pleased, the canals flowing, and the fields abundant. Each act of rule was an offering, each decision a prayer written not on clay but in consequence. As time flowed down the Euphrates, another city began to rise: Uruk. Its mud-brick walls stretched so wide that the poet of the Epic of Gilgamesh would later boast that no mortal could grasp their full length. If Eridu was the cradle of kingship, Uruk was its awakening. Here emerged Enmerkar, a name woven between history and legend. He was said to have built great temples to Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war, and to have established the first forms of writing to communicate across realms and nations. In his reign, language itself became a tool of rule, a revelation that governance required not only strength and faith, but record and reason. Enmerkar's story speaks of a rivalry between Uruk and a distant city called Aratta, a contest not of swords, but of divine favor. The two kings sent messages back and forth inscribed on clay, invoking their gods to prove whose city was truly beloved of heaven. In these ancient words lies the earliest echo of diplomacy, persuasion, and narrative, the realization that stories could wield as much power as armies. The victor was not the one who conquered by blade, but the one who convinced the gods. From these tales, the shape of early kingship emerges, half divine, half human, poised between heaven's decree and earth's demand. The Sumerian ruler was the embodiment of me, the sacred laws of order and civilization. He was not to be worshipped as a god, yet his word carried divine weight. His duty was immense: to maintain harmony between people, nature, and the celestial order that watched from above. And yet, in this blend of myth and history, something very human shines through. The kings of Eridu and Uruk were not distant figures of perfection. They struggled, they prayed, they sought signs in the stars and omens in the river's current. They embodied humanity's first experiment with leadership, the attempt to govern not merely by strength, but by meaning. The Sumerians would later say that kingship descended from heaven. But once it touched the earth, it became bound by all the flaws and ambitions of men. The priests who once ruled the temples now stood beside thrones, whispering divine sanction into mortal ears. Religion had given humanity its first rulers. Now, rulers would begin to reshape religion itself. As Uruk's power grew, so too did its stories. One name began to rise above all others, a king so great that legend refused to let him die. His adventures would travel farther than armies, carved into clay for eternity. That king was Gilgamesh, and through his story, the Sumerians would give humanity its first glimpse of immortality in the heart of ancient Uruk, where walls of baked clay guarded the city like a ring of mountains. There lived a king whose name would echo for 5,000 years, Gilgamesh. His story began as memory and ended as myth, yet through it all, it spoke to something eternal, the human desire to understand what it means to live, to love, and to die. The Sumerians did not write this tale to glorify conquest or divine power. They wrote it to ask questions, questions so vast that even the gods offered no simple answer. Gilgamesh, they said, was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, born of a mortal king and the goddess Nin's son. In him, they saw both perfection and restlessness, a being too great for his city and too flawed for heaven. At the height of Uruk's splendor, he built towering walls and magnificent temples, symbols of a civilization at its zenith. Yet within these achievements burned a deeper emptiness, a longing that power could not satisfy. In the beginning, Gilgamesh ruled with arrogance. He saw himself as invincible, his word as law. The people of Uruk prayed to the gods for relief, and the gods answered not with punishment, but with balance. From the wilderness came Enkidu, a man of nature, clothed in hair and raised among animals. He was created as Gilgamesh's equal, his reflection in raw humanity. When they first met, they wrestled, strength against strength, pride against pride, until both fell laughing, their fury spent. From that struggle was born one of history's first friendships, a bond that would define them both. Together they embarked on impossible quests, to slay monsters, to defy fate, to carve their names into eternity. They journeyed to the cedar forest to confront Humbaba, the guardian of the gods. The clash was fierce, and when the dust settled, they stood victorious, their triumph celebrated in songs and carvings. Yet victory came with a cost. Each act of defiance drew the eyes of the gods closer. When they killed the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Inanna to punish their pride, divine justice fell. Enkidu, the man of the wild, the friend of kings, fell ill. His death was slow and filled with sorrow. For Gilgamesh, it was the first wound no weapon could heal. His grief shattered the illusion of divine strength. For the first time, the great king of Uruk saw himself as mortal, finite, fragile, transient. The story turns inward here, from adventure to introspection. Gilgamesh left his city, wandering the earth in search of the secret of eternal life. He crossed deserts and mountains, rivers of death and oceans of darkness, until he reached Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood, the Sumerian precursor to Noah. Utnapishtim told him a truth both gentle and cruel. Immortality is not for man. And so Gilgamesh returned home, not with eternal life, but with understanding. Standing before the walls of Uruk, he looked upon his creation, the temples, the gates, the towers, and realized that this, too, was immortality, to build, to remember, to be remembered. The tale ends not with victory, but with peace. The king who once sought to conquer the world learned instead to accept his place within it. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than a story. It is a mirror held up to humanity's first civilization. In its verses, written in the wedge marks of cuneiform, we see the earliest articulation of our deepest fears and hopes. The search for friendship, the inevitability of loss, the acceptance of mortality. These are not Sumerian alone, they are human. The clay tablets that preserve this story have outlasted empires, wars, and languages. They remind us that wisdom is not in escaping death, but in understanding life. Modern readers often marvel that such a story existed so early. But to the Sumerians, it was natural. They lived surrounded by both creation and destruction, floods, famine, renewal. Their gods were reflections of the same duality that Gilgamesh faced within himself: power and humility, joy and sorrow, permanence and decay. As night settled over ancient Uruk, priests would recite the verses of Gilgamesh by lamplight, their voices rising softly into the silence of the temple. Those who listened would feel, perhaps, what we feel now, that across millennia, a man once stood upon his city's walls and wondered, as we all do, what it means to endure. The age of Gilgamesh marked the height of Sumer's spiritual and cultural brilliance. Yet beneath this flowering of art and thought, the seeds of rivalry had begun to stir. The city-states, once united by shared gods and trade, would soon turn against one another, each vying for the favor of heaven and the riches of the earth. And so begins the next chapter, when the divine order fractured into the ambitions of men. And the peaceful plains of Sumer became a battleground for power. As the dawn rose over the plains of Sumer, the world had changed. The ziggurats that once stood as shared symbols of faith had become the centers of separate destinies. Each city now had its own god, its own ruler, its own pride. Where once the rivers bound them, ambition began to divide them. The land between the rivers, fertile, flat, and full of promise, had become too small for so many dreams. The ancient harmony of early Sumer, where trade and faith intertwined like the threads of a single tapestry, slowly began to fray. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Umma. Each city glittered with its own achievements, yet each looked upon the other with suspicion. Canals were diverted, trade routes contested, borders redrawn in the dust of the floodplains. What began as small disputes over water and grain would grow into struggles that reshaped civilization itself. In the Sumerian imagination, conflict was not born of hatred but of imbalance. Every act of pride was a challenge to the cosmic order, the divine laws of existence. When one city grew too powerful, it disturbed the harmony that the gods demanded. And yet, to the people of those cities, rivalry felt natural. They believed their patron deities favored them above all others. In Uruk, citizens prayed to Inanna, goddess of love and war, for prosperity and dominance. In Lagash, they invoked Ningirsu, the god of strength and justice. In Kish, their king claimed that kingship itself had descended upon their city from heaven. Each city saw itself as chosen, and in believing so, they prepared to fight for proof. Archaeology reveals this turning point in the soil itself. Layers of burned clay and toppled walls tell silent stories of ambition and loss. The tablets found in Lagash and Umma describe disputes over irrigation canals, lifelines of Sumerian survival. Water, once the giver of life, became the weapon of control. Whoever commanded the canals commanded the future. Armies, though small by modern standards, marched with purpose. Spears glinted under the desert sun, and the air carried the low hum of drums and chants. The first organized wars in recorded history began here, not for glory, but for grain. Yet, even amid rivalry, there was advancement. The need to manage armies, supplies, and alliances spurred innovations in writing, mathematics, and administration. Cities developed intricate bureaucracies to record treaties, debts, and rations. Scribes, once servants of temples, became servants of kings. The clay tablet evolved from a record of harvests into a document of diplomacy and power. Civilization, it seemed, grew stronger through its struggles. In these times, the figure of the king transformed once again. He was no longer merely a high priest or divine intermediary. He became a general, a lawgiver, a builder of walls and empires. Statues depict them standing tall, their eyes wide with the solemn awareness of duty and divinity. The Sumerians believed that the king was chosen by the gods not only to maintain order, but to expand it. Victory in battle was proof of divine favor, defeat, a sign of lost grace. And so, with each war, the line between faith and conquest blurred further. But it would be wrong to see this age only as one of conflict. In their rivalries, the Sumerian cities also inspired each other, in art, in language, in vision. They competed to build higher ziggurats, to write finer hymns, to craft more enduring laws. Even in struggle, they reached for transcendence. This paradox, that human conflict can birth human greatness, began here, in the fields of Sumer. One cannot help but imagine those ancient soldiers, their sandals pressed into the same earth that had once been a garden of gods. As they marched, they carried clay tablets inscribed with prayers, hoping the gods would bless their spears and spare their families. In this mingling of devotion and violence, the human story took one of its earliest, most complex turns. By the time the dust of those early wars settled, the map of Sumer had changed. Uruk's once unquestioned dominance faded, and new powers began to rise from the south and the east. The land was alive with ambition, and soon it would give birth to a figure who would seek not just to rule a city, but to unite them all. From the chaos of rivalry would emerge the dream of unity, and with it, the first empire in the centuries that followed the Age of Gilgamesh. Power in Sumer shifted like the currents of its rivers, flowing, dividing, and converging again. No city held dominance for long. Yet amid the ever-changing alliances and rivalries, one name began to stand above the rest: Kish. Perched in the northern plains of Sumer, Kish became the symbol of a new kind of power, one that reached beyond the city walls and sought to unify the land itself. The phrase King of Kish carried a meaning far greater than geography. To bear that title was to be recognized as the leader of all Sumer. It was not merely a claim of conquest, but of divine legitimacy. The Sumerians believed that kingship itself had first descended from heaven to Kish after the Great Flood. Every ruler who called himself Lugal-Kish, the great man of Kish, claimed to be the earthly custodian of divine order. In this way, a political idea began to take root, that one city and one ruler could embody the unity of many. It was, in essence, the world's first notion of empire. The early kings of Kish, such as Edna, were half lost to history, half bound in legend. Edna's story tells of a shepherd king who sought a plan of birth to grant him a child. Guided by an eagle, he flew toward the heavens, searching for what lay beyond human reach. Whether myth or metaphor, the tale reflects an early Sumerian vision that kingship was a covenant between heaven and earth, a divine trust that demanded both wisdom and humility. Under Kish's influence, Sumer began to knit itself into a network of trade, tribute, and communication. The city's scribes recorded treaties on clay tablets sealed with intricate cylinder impressions, the fingerprints of diplomacy. Roads and river routes connected distant settlements. Goods such as copper, lapis lazuli, and timber flowed through its markets. Power now depended not only on soldiers, but on systems, on record-keeping, resource control, but divine justification. Yet, unity was fragile. The kings of Kish could not hold their supremacy indefinitely. The south, especially Uruk and Ur, resisted northern influence. The title of King of Kish became both a blessing and a burden, claimed by one ruler after another, each seeking to impose order upon a land that cherished independence. The Sumerian city-state was a paradox, fiercely local, yet bound to a shared heritage, deeply pious, yet eternally ambitious. Still, the ideal of Kish endured, the dream that one ruler might bring harmony to all Sumer. This idea would linger for generations, shaping the ambitions of kings yet unborn. The stories etched in clay from this period reveal something profound, that humanity's longing for unity is as ancient as civilization itself. The Sumerians, in their temples and courts, already understood the cost of fragmentation. They yearned for order, for a world where one voice could speak for many, where conflict might be replaced by concord. But order, once imagined, inevitably tempts those who seek it to claim it by force. The kings who inherited the dream of Kish would soon transform it into conquest. As Sumer grew richer and its cities more complex, the balance between cooperation and domination began to tilt. Kings now measured their worth not by wisdom or piety, but by the reach of their armies and the glory of their inscriptions. The era of Kish was an age of ideals, a bridge between the sacred and the imperial. It revealed that the Sumerians had begun to think in scales larger than the individual, larger than the city. They were thinking in terms of civilization itself. But ideals, once born, can ignite ambitions greater than those who conceive them. From the dream of Kish would rise a man who would make that dream real, a ruler whose shadow would stretch far beyond Sumer's plains, into legend and history alike. His name was Sargon of Akkad, from the cradle of Sumer's rival cities, where priests argued with kings and scribes chronicled the will of the gods. There rose a figure who would change the world forever. His name was Sargon, Sarukin, the true king. He was not born into power, nor descended from any divine bloodline. He came from the margins, from the dust beyond the temple walls. Yet within him burned a vision that no Sumerian before had dared to dream, to unite the land of many gods under one crown. According to legend, Sargon's beginning was as humble as it was mysterious. He claimed to have been the child of a priestess, hidden at birth, placed in a basket of reeds, and set adrift upon the Euphrates. The river carried him to the city of Kish, where he was found and raised by a gardener. The tale echoes through time. Centuries later, another child would be set afloat on the Nile in another basket, another river, another destiny. But before Moses, there was Sargon, the foundling who became the first emperor in history. As he grew, Sargon rose from servant to soldier, from soldier to general, and from general to king. With iron discipline and a mind sharpened by hardship, he built what no man had built before, not just a city-state, but an empire. Around 2330 BCE, he seized control of Kish, then marched south to subdue Uruk, Ur, Lagash, then Umma, the proud cities of Sumer. His conquests stretched north into Akkad and west toward the Mediterranean. For the first time, the Fertile Crescent, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, bowed beneath a single rule. The Akkadian Empire was more than conquest, it was transformation. Sargon understood that to rule many peoples, one needed not only soldiers, but systems. He established a centralized bureaucracy, appointing governors loyal to him rather than to their local gods or cities. He standardized weights, measures, and trade routes. His scribes began writing in a new dialect, Akkadian, written with the same cuneiform script as Sumerian, but spoken by Semitic peoples. Through this fusion, the first lingua franca of the ancient world was born. In the temples, Sargon declared himself king of the four quarters of the world, not out of arrogance, but ideology. He was crafting a new narrative, the ruler not as servant of one city's god, but as chosen by all the gods to maintain universal order. This was a profound shift. Kingship was no longer local or sacred in isolation, it was cosmic. The divine right to rule had transcended city walls. But empire comes at a cost. Behind Sargon's triumphs were endless wars of suppression. The Sumerian cities, long accustomed to independence, rebelled time and again. The old priesthoods resented Akkadian interference in temple affairs. Even as Sargon's statues were erected across the land, resentment simmered beneath them. The same rivers that had once carried his cradle now carried whispers of revolt. Still, Sargon's name inspired awe. Ancient inscriptions speak of his unmatched charisma and military might. His army, disciplined and professional, was the first of its kind, soldiers who fought for the king, not merely their city. With them, he founded new capitals, built new temples, and spread a unified vision of civilization. For more than half a century, Sargon ruled, his empire an experiment in scale and ambition. When he died, he left behind a legacy that would outlive the very cities he conquered. His grandsons and successors, though unable to preserve his full dominion, kept alive the idea he had birthed, that humanity could be one under a single order. In the centuries to come, rulers from Babylon to Persia would invoke his name. The concept of the universal ruler, the world emperor, the divinely chosen king, all trace their origin to Sargon of Akkad. Yet, like all great powers, the Akkadian Empire would one day fall. Its cities would crumble under drought, invasion, and rebellion. The gods of Sumer would reclaim their temples. But for a moment in time, a flicker between myth and memory, Sargon stood as the first man to command a world. And in his shadow, the idea of empire, born from Sumer's soil, would never die in the sunlit plains of ancient Mesopotamia. Where reeds whispered beside the rivers and temples reached for the sky, a new kind of power was about to emerge, not born of divine inheritance or priestly decree, where of sheer will. The world's first empire would rise not from nobility, but from obscurity. And its architect would be a man once known only as a cupbearer, Sargon of Akkad. His story begins not in the palaces of kings, but at the river's edge. Ancient inscriptions claim that Sargon was the son of a priestess, forbidden to bear children. To protect him, she sealed her newborn in a basket of reeds and set him adrift upon the Euphrates. The river carried the infant toward destiny, into the arms of a humble gardener, who raised him among the laborers and fields of Kish. The imagery would echo through time, resurfacing in distant scriptures, the tale of the child cast upon the waters, preserved by fate to change the course of nations. As he grew, Sargon entered the service of Ur-Nammu, king of Kish. As his cupbearer, a trusted but lowly position. Yet in that quiet proximity to power, he learned its rhythm, how rulers spoke, how armies moved, how priests shaped belief. He observed, and he waited. When chaos came, as it always did in Sumer, Sargon acted. He seized the throne of Kish and, with the precision of a man who had studied power his entire life, began a campaign that would reshape the world. City after city fell before him. Uruk, Umma, Lagash, and Ur, the proud Sumerian city-states that had for centuries warred with one another over gods, fields, and honor. Sargon subdued them all, forging unity where none had ever existed. Around 2330 BCE, the banner of Akkad, a city whose exact ruins remain hidden even today, rose above the land between the rivers. For the first time, the scattered Sumerian cities bowed to a single ruler. But conquest was only the beginning. Sargon understood that an empire could not stand on fear alone. It needed a system, a soul. He established a centralized administration, appointing governors called Ensi and Sakanaku to oversee distant provinces. He restructured trade, ensuring that silver from Anatolia and timber from Lebanon flowed through Akkad's markets. He built a standing army, a professional force loyal not to city or god, but to the king himself. In doing so, he created the blueprint for empire, one that would echo from Babylon to Rome. His empire was more than military might. It was an act of imagination. Sargon redefined kingship itself. No longer merely the servant of a local deity, he proclaimed himself king of the four quarters of the world. In this title lay a profound shift. Authority no longer limited to borders or temples, but reaching toward universality. For the first time, a man dared to see the world as one realm, and himself as its ruler. Under his reign, the Sumerian and Akkadian cultures intertwined. The Sumerian script was adapted to the Akkadian tongue, forming the bridge between two great linguistic traditions. Records, hymns, and royal decrees multiplied, spreading literacy and administration across the land. The temples of Nippur and Eridu received patronage, binding religion and empire in mutual legitimacy. To the people, Sargon's reign appeared divinely ordained, the natural order restored by a chosen king. Yet beneath the golden surface of unity, the old rivalries lingered. The Sumerian cities, though conquered, had not forgotten their independence. Their gods were many, and their pride was deep. The priests of Enlil and Inanna murmured in discontent, and distant governors grew restless under Akkadian rule. Still, for more than half a century, Sargon held his empire together through wisdom, fear, and charisma. When he died, he left behind not only territory, but an idea that human will could forge divine destiny. His life, from basket to throne, became legend. Even millennia later, his name was remembered alongside the great conquerors who followed. To the Babylonians, Persians, and Assyrians, Sargon was the prototype, the self-made ruler, the man who carved order from chaos. But as with all empires, unity brought both strength and strain. The seeds of centralization, once the source of stability, would soon become instruments of rebellion. Empire brings order, but also fragility. And in the generations after Sargon, both would reveal their true nature. In the generations after Sargon, the empire he built stretched like a shadow across Mesopotamia, vast, admired, and fragile. His sons and grandsons inherited not only land and cities, but the impossible task of holding them together. Among these successors, one name blazed brighter than all others: Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, the man who dared to call himself a god. When Naram-Sin ascended the throne, the Akkadian Empire was at its zenith, yet trembling within. Rebellions flickered in the south, tribes stirred in the mountains, and faith in imperial order began to waver. He inherited a kingdom that had been forged through might. Now it needed myth. And in this moment of uncertainty, Naram-Sin gave the empire a new language of power, one that merged divinity with kingship. He was a warrior, but not a brute. His campaigns were swift and decisive, crushing uprisings and expanding borders deep into Elam, the Zagros, and beyond. The inscriptions from his reign speak of a ruler who saw himself not merely as the servant of gods, but as their living reflection. He took the title King of the Four Quarters, as his grandfather had, as added another word, God. In doing so, Naram-Sin crossed a sacred line that few rulers had dared approach. The ancient Sumerians had long viewed kings as intermediaries between men and gods, never as divine themselves. But Naram-Sin's victories, his wealth, and his command over the known world seemed to defy human limitation. He built temples in his own name, ordered statues of himself crowned with the horned helmet, a symbol once reserved for the gods alone. On his inscriptions, his name was followed by a star, the cuneiform sign of divinity. The empire responded with awe and unease. For some, the deification of the king brought reassurance, the idea that divine order had taken human form, that their ruler was literally the living axis between heaven and earth. For others, it was blasphemy, an act of hubris that defied the very gods who had raised their ancestors from clay. Still, Naram-Sin ruled with brilliance. His reign marked the height of Akkadian power and the flowering of imperial culture. Trade routes from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean carried his seal. Artisans from conquered lands brought new forms of art, bronze, and stonework. The Akkadian language, refined, administrative, and poetic, spread across the Near East, becoming the script of diplomacy and learning for centuries to come. But pride has its own gravity, and even divine kings must answer to the forces they claim to master. The ancient texts tell of a rebellion of all the lands, a coalition of 30 cities rising against Akkad. Naram-Sin crushed them, his armies leaving behind cities razed and fields salted. Yet in the quiet aftermath, fear took root. The victory was too costly, the devastation too deep. Then came the omen. The priests of Nippur recorded that Naram-Sin had defied the will of Enlil, the god of wind and authority. In his arrogance, they said, he had plundered Enlil's temple, and the gods answered with silence. The skies withheld their rain, and the earth cracked beneath famine. From the northern mountains, a new threat appeared, a mysterious people known as the Gutians. Like shadows, they descended upon the plains, swift and merciless. Akkad, once the heart of empire, faltered. The cities that had once offered tribute now turned inward, seeking protection in old loyalties. The gods who had once blessed the Akkadians seemed to withdraw their favor. The divine king found himself abandoned by the very heavens he had sought to join. Still, Naram-Sin's legacy endured. His self-deification marked a turning point in human history, the moment when the idea of divine kingship took root. In later centuries, the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Persia, even the Caesars of Rome would echo his ambition, mortal men clothed in divinity. The horned crown would become a symbol of the eternal struggle between power and humility, order and pride. When Naram-Sin finally fell, he left behind not only a shattered empire, but a question that would echo through ages. Can any man, no matter how great, truly command the gods? And as the Akkadian palaces crumbled under Gutian raids and famine's hand, the age of empire gave way to silence. a silence from which Sumer would have to rise once more. Empires, like rivers, often die in silence before they vanish in storm. The Akkadian Empire, born from Sargon's genius and expanded by Naram-Sin's divinity, seemed eternal, the first true power to bind the known world. But even as its banners fluttered across the fertile plains, the foundations beneath them had begun to crack. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow unraveling, a fading of order, but if the gods themselves had turned away. The ancient tablets speak of a curse. They say Naram-Sin, in his pride, attacked the temple of Enlil in Nippur, shattering the sacred balance that had once bound heaven and earth. Whether history or allegory, the records agree. After his reign, the skies grew harsh, and the soil hardened beneath the sun. Across Mesopotamia, the rivers shrank, crops withered, and famine crept like dust through the cities. This was no single disaster, but a chain of years, a century of drought, perhaps. But the climate itself seemed to rebel against empire. In the chaos that followed, the great cities, Ur, Lagash, Umma, turned inward, closing their gates and guarding their grain. The imperial roads, once alive with trade, fell silent. The governors who had once sworn loyalty to Akkad declared themselves kings. The center could no longer hold. Then came the Gutians. No one knows exactly who they were. Some say they were tribes from the Zagros Mountains, fierce, restless, ungoverned. Others believe they were punishment sent by the gods. To the scribes of Sumer, they were simply the serpent of the mountain, a people who knew no agriculture, no law, and no mercy. They swept across the north like a storm of shadows, burning fields and seizing cities that had already been hollowed by hunger. When they reached Akkad, they found an empire exhausted, its armies thinned, its priests divided, its king dethroned. The once mighty capital, whose very location remains lost to time, fell without the grandeur of its rise. The Gutians left no records, no monuments, no empire of their own, only ruin. To the Sumerians, their arrival marked the first dark age of human civilization. In the Curse of Akkad, a lamentation written generations later, the poets remembered those years with haunting clarity. The great fields produced no grain. The watered gardens bore no fruit. The sheepfolds gave no wool. The fish of the rivers vanished. The people groaned beneath the weight of hunger. It was not merely the end of Akkad. It was the death of a dream. For the first time, humanity had tried to build a single order from many lands, to unite heaven's favor with earthly power. And yet, even that order proved mortal. The empire that had once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean vanished into dust, leaving only scattered tablets to tell its story. Still, in the silence that followed, not all was lost. The Sumerians, survivors of countless floods and wars, endured. In the ruins of Lagash and Ur, new leaders arose, men who looked to the past not with despair, but with remembrance. They studied the old records of Sargon and Naram-Sin, learning both from their triumphs and from their hubris. Slowly, patiently, they began to rebuild the temples, reopen the canals, and restore the order that the Gutians had shattered. For nearly a century, Mesopotamia lay fragmented under foreign rule. Yet, even amid decay, the memory of Akkad persisted, not as tyranny, but as the idea of unity. It whispered through the minds of future kings that humanity could again rise together, not merely under one ruler, but under one destiny. And so, as the Gutian tribes faded into obscurity, a new dawn stirred on the southern horizon. In the city of Ur, an ancient name prepared to return to glory, guided by wise kings who would learn from Akkad's fall to build an empire of their own. From ruin would come renewal. And from silence, the song of Sumer once more in the wake of empire's collapse. The land between the rivers fell silent. The canals lay choked with silt. The temples stood empty. And the gods, once honored by kings and farmers alike, seemed to have turned their faces away. For nearly a century, the plains of Sumer knew only division. The Gutians roamed the north, city-states clung to survival, and memory itself became a fragile thread connecting the people to their glorious past. Yet from the ruins of that long night, a light began to stir once more. It came not from war, but from wisdom, and from a man who sought not dominion, but harmony. His name was Ur-Nammu, king of Ur. When Ur-Nammu ascended to power around 2112 BC, Sumer was a broken mosaic, fragments of cities, faiths, and loyalties scattered across the plain. He did not begin with conquest, but with rebuilding. His reign marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Third Dynasty of Ur, a final flowering of Sumerian civilization before it faded into memory. Ur-Nammu's genius was not in expansion, but in restoration. He understood that a civilization survives not by might, but by structure, by order born of justice. His first acts were practical, yet profound. The canals, lifelines of the Sumerian heartland, were cleared and reopened. Farmlands were remeasured, taxes standardized, and temples restored to the gods who had been neglected during the Gutian chaos. Each city, from Ur to Eridu, felt the rhythm of life returning, the hum of markets, the songs of harvest, the chants of scribes who once again recorded offerings to Enlil and Inanna. But Ur-Nammu's most enduring achievement was not made of brick or water. It was written in clay, the world's earliest known code of law. Long before Hammurabi inscribed his edicts in Babylon, Ur-Nammu's scribes etched into tablets the first structured attempt to balance power, morality, and humanity. His code sought to replace vengeance with justice, chaos with reason. The preamble of the code declares his purpose in serene simplicity. I established equity in the land. I banished enmity and violence. I brought peace to Sumer and Akkad. The laws themselves were revolutionary in their restraint. They replaced blood-for-blood retaliation with fines and compensations, an early recognition that order depended on proportion, not cruelty. The code addressed theft, marriage, injury, and property, the quiet but vital structures of everyday life. Through these laws, Ur-Nammu transformed kingship from divine authority into moral stewardship. He was not a conqueror of lands, but of injustice. Under his rule, Ur became more than a city. It became a symbol of rebirth. At its heart rose a magnificent ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, guardian of Ur. Layer upon layer, brick upon brick, it climbed toward the heavens, not as a monument to human pride, but as a bridge between the divine and the mortal. Its terraces shimmered in the desert light, a visible promise that the gods and humankind were once again in harmony. Trade flourished once more. Merchants carried Ur's goods, wool, copper, and lapis lazuli, across distant lands. The scribal schools of Sumer revived, teaching the next generation to read and write in cuneiform, the sacred language of their ancestors. For the first time since the fall of Akkad, there was a sense of continuity, that the old world, wounded but unbroken, could still renew itself. Ur-Nammu's reign was brief in the span of empires, but its serenity was profound. His leadership was remembered as measured, just, and wise, a reflection of the very balance his laws sought to preserve. In him, the Sumerians saw not the fiery ambition of Sargon, nor the divine pride of Naram-Sin, but something humbler and greater, the restoration of rightness after ruin. He died as he had lived, in service to the land. The tablets record that he fell in battle, perhaps defending the frontiers he had so carefully stabilized. Yet his death did not extinguish the order he created. The code, the canals, and the ziggurat endured, tangible echoes of his vision for a just world. And so, in the twilight of Sumer, Ur-Nammu's laws became a mirror for all that civilization aspired to be, not eternal, but fair, not divine, but balanced. His work became the foundation upon which his successors would build Sumer's final golden age, a moment of brilliance before the long night of history returned. From ruin, he had rebuilt order. From chaos, he had shaped justice. And in that balance, Sumer found its final peace. When Ur-Nammu's reign came to a close, his son Shulgi inherited more than a throne. He inherited a dream of order reborn from chaos. The empire his father had rebuilt was strong, yet still fragile, bound by new laws, and the faint hope that Sumer could once again become a land of brilliance. Shulgi was not content to merely maintain what had been restored. He saw beyond administration and conquest. He saw the possibility of transforming his father's empire into a civilization of the mind and spirit. In the early years of his rule, Shulgi proved himself both capable and visionary. He strengthened the roads that connected Ur to the distant reaches of Mesopotamia through Uruk, Eridu, and the northern plains where traders from distant lands arrived with copper, timber, and precious stones. These roads were more than paths of commerce. They were the arteries through which ideas flowed. Along them traveled scribes, scholars, and poets carrying clay tablets filled with hymns, laws, and stories, the lifeblood of Sumerian intellect. Shulgi's reign was one of deliberate harmony between discipline and art. He organized the empire with military precision but ruled with a poet's heart. Under his guidance, a network of scribal schools, idubas, flourished across Sumer. These were not mere classrooms, but sanctuaries of learning where young men trained to become scribes, record keepers, but historians. Within their mud-brick walls, the cuneiform script evolved into its most refined form. Mathematics, literature, astronomy, and theology were all subjects of study, turning Sumer into a cradle of structured education long before the idea of universities would grace the world. It was during Shulgi's reign that the first libraries appeared, collections of clay tablets carefully arranged and catalogued, the ancestors of all human archives. These tablets preserved hymns to gods, royal decrees, and even personal letters between merchants and families. Knowledge, once the secret of priests and kings, began to spread among those who could read the marks of civilization impressed in clay. But Shulgi's ambitions extended beyond scholarship. He was a patron of music and poetry, believing that the soul of a kingdom resided not in its walls or armies, but in the rhythm of its songs. Court musicians composed hymns praising the gods and their king in equal measure. The temples of Ur and Nippur became alive with sound, harps, flutes, and drums echoing beneath the towering ziggurats. In these moments, worship and art became one, each feeding the other in an unbroken circle of devotion. Shulgi's inscriptions reveal a ruler both proud and deeply aware of legacy. He called himself the shepherd who knows his people and the fast runner who surpasses all men. In royal hymns, he even claimed divine favor, suggesting that he had achieved a near godlike perfection in both mind and body. Whether these boasts were pure propaganda or sincere belief, they reflected a ruler whose vision was larger than his lifetime. To Shulgi, kingship was not merely a political role, it was a divine art, the shaping of a civilization's destiny. Under his hand, the great ziggurat of Ur, begun by his father, rose to even greater splendor. Its layered terraces symbolized the link between heaven and earth, a physical manifestation of the Sumerian belief that humanity could touch the divine through devotion and creation. Around it grew bustling markets, workshops, and homes of priests and artisans. The city of Ur shone as the brightest jewel of Sumer, a place where faith, order, and beauty intertwined. Meanwhile, Shulgi's efficient bureaucracy ensured that the empire remained prosperous. He standardized weights and measures, established rest houses along trade routes, and maintained a standing army ready to defend the borders. His reign stretched for nearly half a century, an extraordinary span in an age often ruled by turmoil. And for most of those years, peace held. Farmers tilled the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, merchants prospered, and scribes chronicled the king's achievements on tablets that still survive today. Yet even in times of harmony, shadows gather quietly. The same system that made Sumer organized also made it rigid. The same peace that nourished art also dulled the vigilance of war. The empire's wealth attracted envy from neighboring peoples, the Amorites in the west, the Elamites in the east. While Shulgi's reforms made Ur a beacon of civilization, they could not shield it forever from the shifting sands of time. Still, in the long memory of history, Shulgi's reign stands as Sumer's final dawn. His vision extended the life of the world's first civilization by a generation, perhaps more. He proved that even after centuries of war and decline, a people could rise again through the power of knowledge, art, and faith. Under his rule, Sumer was not merely rebuilt, it was reimagined. And so, when the last songs of Ur would one day fade into silence, they would carry the echoes of Shulgi's dream, a civilization not defined solely by conquest. when by the beauty it left behind. As the music of Ur filled the desert air, unseen forces began to stir beyond its walls. Forces that would soon test the strength of all that Shulgi had built. Even as hymns echoed from the towering ziggurats of Ur, the sands outside crept closer. The empire that Shulgi and his father had built with such care began to falter, not from the strike of swords, but from the slow, unrelenting weight of time. Sumer, radiant in wisdom and culture, entered its twilight with the quiet grace of an aging monarch, aware that its greatness could not last forever. The first cracks appeared in the rhythm of the land itself. The once gentle rivers, lifelines of Sumer's prosperity, began to change course. Centuries of irrigation had altered the soil, leaving behind a bitter crust of salt that poisoned the fields. Harvests grew thin, canals silted over, and villages once rich with barley and dates turned to dust. The climate grew harsher, the rains less frequent, and the winds more cruel. What had been the cradle of civilization slowly became a weary plain, a land tired of feeding empires. Inside the cities, the economy strained under its own weight. The temples that had once managed trade and tribute now overflowed with debt tablets. Peasants fled their farms to escape taxation, and artisans struggled as resources dwindled. The order that had sustained Ur's golden age began to unravel thread by thread. Even the once mighty scribal bureaucracy, so precise under Shulgi's hand, became sluggish, burdened by corruption and the complexity of governing a vast realm with fading strength. Beyond the borders, the world was shifting. To the west, waves of Amorite tribes drifted across the deserts, seeking fertile land and new beginnings. To the east, the Elamites of the Iranian plateau watched with patience, their ambitions sharpening as Sumer's guard weakened. Trade routes grew dangerous, caravans were raided, cities along the frontier fell silent. Ur's power, once unquestioned, began to flicker like a fading lamp. And yet, within the heart of the empire, faith endured. The priests continued their daily rituals, chanting to gods who seemed ever more distant. Clay tablets still recorded offerings, hymns, and omens. It was as though Sumer tried to write itself into eternity, even as its body decayed. There was beauty in that defiance, the quiet dignity of a people who, even in decline, chose order over chaos, song over silence. When the end came, it was not sudden but inevitable. Around 2004 BCE, the Elamites swept into the city of Ur. The ziggurat still stood, its terraces gleaming in the sun, but the empire that had once unified Sumer was no more. Kings would continue to rule these lands, but none would call themselves king of Sumer and Akkad with the same divine confidence again. Still, the Sumerians had not vanished. Their language, their gods, and their ideas endured. In the centuries that followed, new powers would rise from the same soil: Babylon, Assyria, Persia. Each, in its own way, carried forward the light that Sumer first kindled. And thus, even as the sun set over Ur, its glow remained, not extinguished, but transformed, a quiet ember burning beneath the sands of time. The last king of Ur watched as the river that once gave life now carried it away. Under the heavy skies of a dying age, Ibbi-Sin, heir to Ur-Nammu's proud line, sat within his crumbling palace, surrounded by the ghosts of a greater past. Outside the walls, the land that had once been called the Garden of the Gods lay parched and fractured. The canals were clogged, the crops thin, and the songs of harvest had turned to cries for bread. Sumer, mother of cities, mistress of writing, the first light of civilization, stood at the edge of silence. For generations, the kings of Ur had ruled with divine authority, tracing their lineage back to the sacred union of gods and men. But by the 21st century BCE, their world had changed beyond recognition. The Elamites, fierce mountain warriors from the east, descended upon Sumer like an unstoppable tide. Their bronze weapons and swift assaults pierced the weary defenses of an empire that had forgotten how to fight. To the west, the Amorites, nomadic tribes from the deserts beyond the Euphrates, migrated steadily into the fertile plains, settling, trading, and at times plundering. They were not conquerors at first, but survivors, drawn by the promise of Sumer's fading wealth. Ibisin's armies, once the pride of Ur, were scattered. His governors, fearing isolation, pledged loyalty to local powers. The sacred cities, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, fell one by one, their temples looted, their idols carried off. For nearly a decade, Ur stood alone, an island of faith amid a rising sea of chaos. In desperation, the king sent pleas for aid carved onto clay, letters to distant governors, to the gods themselves, but none were answered. The words that had once commanded obedience now returned in silence. When the Elamites finally breached the city's gates, there was little resistance. Fire swept through the temples, smoke darkened the ziggurat, and the treasures of centuries were taken as spoils. The statue of Nana, the moon god of Ur, was carried away, a sign that even the divine had abandoned their city. The proud scribes of Ur recorded the devastation with sorrow rather than anger. One lament, known today as the Lament for Ur, speaks in haunting verses. Its people groan, its walls lie in dust, its gods have fled to heaven. And yet, this was not an ending, not truly. Though the political heart of Sumer stopped beating, its pulse continued elsewhere. The Amorites who now ruled these lands did not destroy what they found, they absorbed it. They took Sumerian scribes into their service, adopted their gods, and preserved their language as the tongue of ritual and scholarship. The clay tablets still bore the same cuneiform marks. The hymns still invoked the old names of Enlil and Inanna. What had been Sumer's identity became its inheritance, absorbed into the blood of Mesopotamia itself. The fall of Ur marked more than a political collapse. It was a quiet transformation. The age of the city-state, of divine kingship and sacred order, gave way to something new, an age where empires would span horizons, where one city's fall would give rise to another's glory. The Amorites, once wanderers, began to settle along the rivers. Among their settlements rose a modest town, not yet known to history, but destined to inherit all of Sumer's wisdom, a place called Babylon. Thus, Sumer did not die. It changed form, flowing like the rivers it once worshipped, into new channels and new minds. The spirit of invention, the gift of writing, the dream of justice, these survived, carried onward by those who followed. In the fading light of Ur's last sunset, the world's first civilization gave way to the next, not through conquest alone, but through the quiet continuity of memory. The new kings of the plains spoke another tongue, but wrote in Sumer's hand. When the Amorites settled the ruins of the south, they found not a dead land, but a sleeping one. The clay tablets of Sumer still spoke. The ziggurats still cast long shadows across the plains. From the fragments of fallen cities, the Amorites built anew, and in their hands, the spirit of Sumer took on a new face, Babylon. At first, Babylon was only a modest settlement along the Euphrates, little more than one of many Amorite enclaves dotting the plains of Mesopotamia. Its walls were small, its temples humble, its rulers little known. Yet its position was perfect, nestled between old trade routes, watered by canals that still remembered Sumerian engineering, and guided by scribes who preserved the memory of an older order. These scribes became the bridge between worlds. They taught the Amorite kings the art of writing, the etiquette of diplomacy, the mathematics of taxation, and the rituals of divine kingship. Through them, the wisdom of Sumer flowed quietly into a new civilization. The Amorites, practical and adaptive, embraced what they found. The cuneiform script, once etched in reverence to Sumerian gods, now recorded the decrees of Babylonian kings. The temples, rebuilt upon ancient foundations, were rededicated to familiar yet renamed gods. Inanna became Ishtar. Enlil's power passed into the hands of Marduk. The old pantheon did not vanish. It evolved, reshaped by new rulers who saw in it a reflection of their own divine right. Religion became continuity disguised as change. Among these early Amorite rulers, one name would rise above all others, Hammurabi. When he came to power in the 18th century BCE, Babylon was still one city among many. But Hammurabi possessed the vision and discipline of a true unifier. Through careful alliances and calculated wars, he brought the patchwork of Amorite states under one banner, forging the first Babylonian empire. And though his achievements were many, his most enduring legacy was carved not in stone walls, but in law. The Code of Hammurabi stands as both a monument and a mirror, a reflection of the Sumerian idea that justice must be written, preserved, and applied equally. The Sumerians had once recorded Ur-Nammu's laws on clay. Hammurabi raised them upon a black diorite stele, tall and unyielding, for all to see. To bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, it declared, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong may not oppress the weak. These words echoed the same moral order Sumer had sought centuries before. Hammurabi's code was not a rupture from the past, it was its refinement. In Babylon's courts, scribes continued to use the Sumerian language for official and sacred writings. Though the Amorite tongue became common speech, Sumerian remained the language of gods, scholars, and law. Every new generation of scribes began their training not in Amorite but in Sumerian, reciting hymns to Enlil and Nana, copying lists of proverbs first written 1,000 years earlier in the cities of Ur and Lagash. To write, in Babylon, was to remember. The temples, too, bore this legacy. The great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose in the same spirit as the ziggurats of Sumer. Priests still measured time by lunar cycles. Rituals still involved the careful mixing of incense, oil, and prayer. Even the act of building became an echo, the Amorite masons following blueprints set down by forgotten hands. Every brick of Babylon carried Sumer's imprint. And yet, there was transformation. Where Sumer's gods ruled from many city-states, Babylon sought unity. The Amorite kings elevated Marduk, a once minor deity, to supremacy. Under him, the old pantheon found order, a divine hierarchy mirroring the human one. This idea, that heaven reflected the empire, became one of Mesopotamia's most enduring legacies. It gave the world its first image of cosmic law, the belief that the universe itself was governed by order, not chance. Through the Amorites, Sumer found immortality. Its culture was no longer bound to one people or one land, but absorbed into the bloodstream of a new world. From Babylon, the Sumerian inventions of writing, law, and astronomy would spread westward to the Levant and Egypt, and eastward into Persia and beyond. What began beside the Tigris and Euphrates would become the shared heritage of civilization. As centuries passed, the Sumerian tongue fell silent, spoken now only by priests in whispered chants. But its influence endured in every stroke of the stylus, every line of poetry, every invocation to a sky god. Babylon was Sumer reborn, more structured, more centralized, yet still carrying the essence of the world's first dreamers. Though Sumer vanished from maps, its words and gods lived on in the tongues of its heirs, an unbroken whisper carried through time, from the first clay tablet to the last temple song. Even forgotten gods find new names. Long after the Sumerian cities crumbled into dust, their deities continued to breathe within the temples of Babylon and the palaces of Assyria. Faith, unlike stone, does not erode, it transforms. The Sumerians had once looked upon their gods not as distant masters, but as forces woven into every rhythm of existence. The flowing rivers, the ripening of barley, the shining of the moon. When their civilization faded, these divine patterns endured, finding new voices and new forms beneath the same Mesopotamian sky. Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war, became Ishtar, fierce, beautiful, and unpredictable. Her passions ruled hearts and empires alike. The Babylonians sang her hymns with the same reverence once heard in Uruk's temples. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, transformed into Ea, the cunning craftsman of creation who whispered knowledge to kings and scribes. Utu, the shining sun who judged the deeds of men, lived on as Shamash, the just arbiter whose light revealed both truth and sin. Each god, though renamed, carried forward the same essence, continuity disguised as evolution. Through these transformations, The Babylonian and later Assyrian pantheons became living museums of Sumer's spirituality. The sacred stories persisted, retold in new dialects, but rooted in the same moral soil. Flood myths, tales of divine councils, the descent of goddesses to the underworld, all found renewed life, shaping not only Mesopotamian religion but the broader mythology of the ancient world. The Sumerian idea that humanity existed as caretakers of divine order, servants who maintained balance between heaven and earth, remained at the heart of Babylonian belief. Divine kingship, too, endured. The Sumerian notion that rulers were chosen by the gods, their power legitimized through sacred duty, became a cornerstone of Babylonian and Assyrian rule. When Hammurabi claimed that Marduk had entrusted him with justice, he echoed the same divine covenant once spoken in the temples of Ur. The concept of cosmic order, that human law should reflect celestial harmony, linked every era from Sumer to Babylon, and eventually to empires yet unborn. Thus, the gods of Sumer never died, they migrated. Their symbols, their rituals, their stories flowed like underground rivers, feeding the roots of later faiths. From the temples of Babylon to the myths of Greece and the scriptures of Abrahamic tradition, faint traces of their divine architecture remained, reimagined but recognizable. As Babylon rose, the Sumerian spirit diffused, quietly entering history's bloodstream. The names changed, the languages shifted, but the essence endured, that between heaven and earth lies a fragile order, kept alive by remembrance, ritual, but the written word. And so the Sumerians, though long vanished, achieved the one immortality they most revered, to live on in the memory of gods. The world's first civilization disappeared so completely, it became a myth itself. Where once the spires of ziggurats pierced the southern sky, only wind and silence remained. The land between the rivers, once alive with the hum of scribes, the chant of priests, and the clatter of merchants, fell into stillness. Sumer, the birthplace of writing law and kingship, faded not through a single act of destruction, and through the slow and patient erasure of memory. As the centuries turned, Sumerian ceased to be a living tongue. By 1800 BCE, even in Babylon, it had become the language of scholars and priests, preserved only in hymns and sacred inscriptions. Children no longer learned it from their mothers, they learned it from tablets. Its sounds became foreign, its grammar ritualistic. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Sumerian was as Latin would one day be to Europe, revered, quoted, but no longer spoken. When the last temple schools closed their doors, the words of Sumer went silent for nearly 2,000 years. The cities too were reclaimed by time. Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu, once centers of the known world, dwindled into villages and vanished into mounds of clay. The Euphrates shifted course, leaving canals to dry and walls to crumble. Sand filled the courtyards where kings had walked, and shepherds led flocks across the ruins of once great capitals. The names of the Sumerian kings, Gilgamesh, Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, became whispers without meaning. To the later inhabitants of Mesopotamia, they were as distant as the gods themselves. Yet the disappearance of Sumer was not only physical, it was also conceptual. Later civilizations inherited its inventions without knowing their origins. Writing, irrigation, astronomy, law, all became part of a broader Mesopotamian identity, their Sumerian roots obscured beneath centuries of translation and adaptation. The Babylonians claimed the glories of the past as their own, the Assyrians followed. And by the time of the Persians, the very word Sumer had vanished from memory. No chronicler, no inscription, no story preserved the name. To the ancient Greeks, who would one day study the lands of the East, the great cities of Mesopotamia were already ruins of uncertain age. Herodotus, the father of history, spoke of Babylon with awe, but knew nothing of Ur. The Sumerians were, by then, ghosts buried under the achievements of those they had inspired. Their tablets lay hidden beneath the desert, their temples flattened into mounds called tells, hills that villagers thought were natural formations. Beneath each one, the bones of history slept undisturbed. And so, the Sumerians achieved a paradoxical immortality. They had given the world the means to remember, but were themselves forgotten. The script they had invented to speak across time became the tool by which their memory was buried, overwritten by newer languages, newer empires. Civilization had built upon their foundation so completely that its makers were lost beneath the weight of their own creation. Yet there is a quiet grace in this kind of disappearance. The Sumerians had once believed that the gods measured time in cycles: creation, growth, decay, and renewal. Perhaps their own vanishing was simply part of that eternal rhythm. The rivers that once nourished them still flowed. The stars they charted still traced their paths across the night sky. The ideas they birthed, writing law and faith, continued to shape humanity, even when their name did not. For 3,000 years, the Sumerians slept beneath the sands, their story erased from the living world. But time, like the river, has a way of uncovering what it once buried. And so began the second life of Sumer, not as a nation, but as a rediscovered dream. On a Persian cliff, the silence of 4,000 years finally spoke. For millennia, the clay tablets of Sumer lay buried beneath the dust of their own forgotten cities. To those who lived above them, shepherds, farmers, traders, they were nothing but fragments of useless clay. Yet, on their surfaces, pressed by stylus tips long turned to dust, slept the oldest recorded thoughts of humankind. And all it took was one question, one spark of curiosity, to begin awakening them. The modern rediscovery of Sumer began not in the plains of Mesopotamia, but high in the mountains of Persia. In 1835, a British officer named Henry Creswick Rawlinson was stationed near the village of Behistun, where a massive rock face loomed over the caravan route. Upon it, carved into the cliff, were rows of strange wedge-shaped symbols, beneath a royal figure trampling his enemies. Locals said it was ancient, older than anyone could remember. To Rawlinson's trained eye, it was more than a curiosity, it was a message. The Behistun inscription had been carved nearly 2,500 years earlier by the Persian king Darius the Great. It recorded his victories in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all in the same wedge-shaped script that scholars called cuneiform. The Old Persian portion, written in a language closer to known tongues, became the key. Rawlinson, risking his life on rope ladders to copy the symbols by hand, spent years comparing, translating, and guessing. Letter by letter, word by word, the stones began to whisper their meaning. By 1847, Rawlinson had cracked Old Persian. But his curiosity did not stop there. What of the other 2 scripts, the ones no one could read? They belonged to older, deeper layers of history. Over decades, Rawlinson and other scholars, Edward Hinks, Julius Oppert, and Henry Fox Talbot, began piecing together their secrets. Through collaboration and rivalry, they decoded the patterns, finding that beneath the Babylonian and Assyrian languages lay an even older one that did not resemble any known tongue. That lost language was Sumerian. The discovery changed everything. For centuries, it had been assumed that civilization began with Babylon. But the tablets unearthed at Uruk, and Lagash told a different story, one of a people who predated the Babylonians by thousands of years. Their tablets spoke of kings and temples, of hymns and laws, of gods and floods. It was as if the oldest layers of human memory had been suddenly unsealed. The thrill of this rediscovery electrified the world of archaeology. In the mid-19th century, European explorers, inspired by biblical stories and classical texts, began excavating the mounds of Mesopotamia. What they found astonished them. Beneath the sands lay libraries, tens of thousands of clay tablets, perfectly preserved. At Nineveh, Layard uncovered the royal archive of Ashurbanipal, containing texts written in multiple languages. Among them were copies of even older works, copied from Sumerian originals. The most shocking of these was a poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose story of a great flood predated the book of Genesis. The world began to realize that what had once been myth might, in part, be memory. For scholars, the rediscovery of cuneiform was not merely academic, it was existential. Humanity had always believed that its history began with Egypt, Greece, or the Bible. But now, clay tablets from a forgotten age told a deeper story, that before them all, there had been Sumer, a civilization that had written the first words, mapped the first stars, and defined what it meant to be human. Each deciphered tablet was a resurrection. Through them, Sumerian voices returned, kings boasting of their conquests, priests describing rituals, poets praising gods long forgotten. Even ordinary citizens spoke again, merchants recording debts, students practicing grammar, lovers writing prayers for safe return. It was as if time itself had reversed, restoring the conversation between the ancient and the modern. The irony was profound. The Sumerians had created writing to preserve their words forever, yet it took thousands of years for anyone to read them again. The medium had outlived the message, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to listen. By the dawn of the 20th century, cuneiform was no longer a mystery. Universities across Europe and America established departments dedicated to Assyriology and Sumerology. The names of forgotten cities, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, once again entered the tongues of scholars and storytellers. The silence of 4 millennia was broken, and the first chapter of human history was restored. The rediscovery of cuneiform was not simply about language, it was about memory. It reminded the world that even when civilizations fall, their words endure. Beneath the dust of time, the Sumerians had been waiting for us to remember them. And as we finally did, the oldest voice of humanity spoke again, clear, fragile, and eternal. The rediscovery of their words breathed life back into their world. Beneath the desert's stillness, an ancient city waited to be remembered. For centuries, travelers had passed over the low mounds of southern Iraq without knowing that under their feet lay the bones of the world's first cities. The sands hid ziggurats, temples, and palaces, all swallowed by time. But in the early 20th century, human curiosity once again began to dig into the earth, determined to meet the ancestors who first built civilization. In 1922, Sir Leonard Woolley, a British archaeologist, began excavations at a mound locals called Tel al-Makiyar, the site of ancient Ur. What he uncovered would stun the modern world. As Woolley's team brushed away the dust of millennia, monumental staircases emerged, the remains of the great ziggurat of Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu 4,000 years ago. Layer by layer, the dead city began to breathe again. But it was beneath the ziggurat that the true revelation waited. Woolley discovered a vast cemetery, over 2,000 tombs, some ordinary, some royal. Inside these royal graves of Ur, time stood still. Gold daggers, lyres inlaid with lapis lazuli, helmets of pure silver, and delicate jewelry adorned the remains of queens and warriors. One tomb, that of Queen Pwabi, was so richly furnished that it seemed to sparkle under torchlight. Her attendants still lay beside her, forever silent, buried with their queen in what Woolley called a death pit. These discoveries shattered old assumptions. The Sumerians were not a primitive people fumbling toward civilization. They were civilization. Their artistry rivaled that of ancient Egypt. Their organization, their spirituality, their music, all revealed a society of extraordinary refinement. Meanwhile, farther north at Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh, excavators uncovered the massive temple precincts of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Beneath layers of mud brick, they found cylinder seals, clay tablets, and early pictographs, the transitional steps toward true writing. Each layer peeled back was not just soil, but time itself, revealing how humans learned to record thought. Every artifact seemed to whisper a story: the craftsman's hand, the queen's pride, the priest's devotion. When Woolley's discoveries were first displayed in London, crowds stared in disbelief. Civilization, it turned out, had not begun in marble temples or pyramids, but in clay and reed, by people who had been forgotten for thousands of years. Through the dust and silence of their ruins, the Sumerians were no longer ghosts. Their faces, their jewelry, their songs, all returned. The dead cities had spoken again, shimmering in gold and lapis under modern light. As modern eyes met ancient clay, the Sumerians spoke once more, not in words this time, but in wonder. Every word we write, every hour we count, carries Sumer's shadow. long before quills touched parchment or pens marked paper. Before calendars guided nations and mathematics measured the universe, there were the Sumerians, shaping the foundations of human understanding with nothing more than clay and a reed stylus. In the bustling cities of Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, the earliest scribes pressed wedge-shaped impressions into wet clay, giving rise to cuneiform, humanity's first writing system. What began as simple marks to record grain deliveries or livestock inventories soon evolved into literature, law, and history itself. Writing was not merely a tool of administration. It was a revolution of the mind. For the first time, humans could externalize thought, preserve memory, and communicate across time and space. Contracts, trade records, hymns to gods, and royal decrees could endure beyond a single lifetime. The Sumerians understood that a word set in clay could outlast empires, ensuring that knowledge was no longer transient but eternal. It is no exaggeration to say that writing made civilization possible. The ledger of grain allowed economies to expand, the law tablet allowed justice to be consistent, and the literary text allowed ideas to live beyond one generation. Parallel to writing was Sumer's profound engagement with time. The priests of Nippur and Ur meticulously observed the heavens, charting the movements of the moon, the sun, and the stars. From these observations emerged the first calendars, designed to guide planting, harvesting, and religious festivals. They divided the year into months, each tied to lunar cycles. And their innovations laid the groundwork for the sexagesimal system, a base, 60 framework that defined minutes, hours, and even the 360-degree circle. Every sunrise and sunset, every measurement of time that modern humans rely upon, carries the echo of Sumerian calculation. Mathematics, too, flourished. Sumerian scribes developed tables for multiplication, division, and fractions, enabling them to plan irrigation, manage trade, and construct monumental buildings. Geometry allowed them to map fields and align ziggurats with celestial bodies. The knowledge that numbers could describe reality, from the curve of a canal to the flow of a river, transformed abstract thought into practical action. It is here, in the careful application of logic and observation, that Sumerians became the first engineers of society. Record-keeping extended beyond grain and labor. The Sumerians cataloged mythology, medicine, and astronomical events. They recorded omens, eclipses, and floods, understanding that past events could inform the future. Libraries in Ur and Nippur, collections of clay tablets, became centers of learning, offering wisdom to those who sought it. Their meticulous documentation ensured that human knowledge could accumulate, rather than vanish with the passing of generations. What emerges from these innovations is not simply a story of tools, but of a mindset. The Sumerians viewed the world as intelligible, governed by patterns, measured by numbers, and expressible through symbols. Writing and time, mathematics and record-keeping, allowed humans to step beyond immediate survival, to plan, to reason, and to dream. Every modern ledger, diary, clock, or calendar owes its lineage to the scribes of Uruk. Every concept of historical memory, legal precedent, and scholarly inquiry began with impressions in clay. By creating ways to write, to measure, and to count, the Sumerians shaped not only their own society, but the trajectory of civilization itself. Their innovations did more than record life, they defined how we understand it. And as the clay tablets hardened in the sun, so too did the foundations of human knowledge, echoing through millennia into the world we inhabit today. Before nations and borders, there was already law. In the sun-baked cities of Sumer, the earliest humans to organize themselves beyond mere kinship recognized a fundamental truth: society cannot endure without rules. From the bustling streets of Ur to the temple courts of Lagash, scribes etched into clay not only accounts of grain and trade, but the principles that would bind communities together. In these laws, written long before Hammurabi or any later code, one finds the blueprint of civilization itself. Sumerian law was practical, measured, and surprisingly sophisticated. Property rights were protected, contracts enforced, and the responsibilities of each citizen clearly delineated. a farmer's boundary line, a merchant's debt, or a temple servant's duties were all documented, reducing disputes and ensuring that the community could function smoothly. Even in these early systems, there existed the notion of accountability. A man could not simply claim another's goods or labor without consequence. Collective responsibility was understood as well. A household or even a village could be held accountable for negligence, tying individuals to the health of the society as a whole. The famous Code of Ur-Nammu, crafted in the 21st century BCE, stands as a testament to the Sumerians' desire for justice. Its provisions were written not to glorify kings, but to protect the weak and regulate interactions. Penalties were measured, proportional, and intended to restore order rather than simply punish. Though hierarchical distinctions existed, nobles, commoners, and slaves faced different consequences. The very act of codifying law represented a radical idea that society, not just rulers or gods, could define fairness. Beyond punishment, Sumerian law created opportunity. Contracts for trade, marriage agreements, and apprenticeship arrangements allowed people to negotiate, plan, and collaborate with predictability. A farmer could lease land, a craftsman could sell his wares, a temple could hire laborers. Each transaction was recorded on clay tablets, providing a shared memory that prevented disputes and allowed commerce to flourish. The scribes who managed these records became the backbone of the bureaucratic state, ensuring that knowledge and enforcement traveled beyond the reach of any single ruler. Law in Sumer was intertwined with religion, yet it was grounded in pragmatism. Temples, dedicated to the gods, often served as courts and record offices, linking divine oversight with human accountability. To act unjustly was not only socially unacceptable, but sacrilegious. The sacred and the civic existed in harmony, teaching that order in human affairs mirrored cosmic order, a concept that would echo throughout Mesopotamia, and later human governance. The legacy of Sumerian law extends beyond fines and punishments. It formalized ideas of equity, contractual obligation, and social responsibility. It provided mechanisms to mediate conflict, to preserve property, and to sustain commerce. In doing so, it allowed cities to grow, economies to expand, and culture to flourish. Without such structures, the towering ziggurats, the libraries of Ur, and the epic stories of Gilgamesh might never have emerged. Society would have collapsed into chaos rather than building the stage upon which civilization could play. Yet civilization is not only built on rules, it's built on stories. Laws and regulations form the skeleton, but human imagination, myth, but narrative provide the life. The Sumerians understood this interplay. Order was necessary, but so too was meaning. Their laws kept society functioning, but their stories, hymns. But epics gave that society purpose. And so, in Sumer, justice and narrative grew side by side, one guiding behavior, the other shaping the soul of humanity. In Sumer's songs, the human heart first found its voice. Long before Homer's epics or the sacred texts of later civilizations, the people of Uruk and Eridu composed hymns and tales that explored the depths of human experience. Love, fear, grief, ambition, and devotion, all were woven into clay tablets, etched in cuneiform, meant to endure. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were a mirror reflecting the earliest articulations of the human psyche, capturing questions that would echo across millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous of these works, portrays a king who is at once divine and deeply human. Through his friendship with Enkidu, his confrontation with mortality, and his search for immortality, the narrative examines what it means to live, to love, and to face the inevitability of death. Even in tales of gods and monsters, the emotions resonate because they speak to concerns that are timeless: companionship, the fear of oblivion, and the quest for meaning. The Sumerians recognized that myths could teach wisdom as much as law or astronomy could teach skill. Hymns to deities such as Inanna, Nanna, and Enki reveal another facet of their psyche: devotion intertwined with wonder. These compositions celebrate the beauty of the natural world, the rhythm of the seasons, and the cycles of birth and death. Through poetic language, They gave expression to gratitude, reverence, and the human longing to understand forces far greater than oneself. In temples, such hymns were recited aloud, binding communities together in shared experience and reminding each person of their place within the cosmic order. Sumerian literature also grappled with moral and philosophical questions. Stories of floods, divine judgment, and heroic quests were not only reflections of actual events or historical memory, and meditations on human responsibility, resilience, and ingenuity. Even humor and irony found their way into scribal exercises, showing that the Sumerians understood subtlety and self-awareness. These narratives became a framework for thinking about life, providing a language in which human beings could negotiate fear, ambition, and hope. Importantly, the Sumerians did not see stories as static. They were living instruments, meant to be memorized, performed, and adapted. Each recitation connected the present to the past, teaching that knowledge, emotion, and culture could be transmitted across generations. Poetry became a vessel not just for memory, but for identity itself. Through these tales, the Sumerians discovered a way to assert their humanity against the ephemeral nature of life. These myths, hymns, and epics extend beyond their immediate context. Later Mesopotamian civilizations absorbed them. Echoes of Sumerian poetry can be traced in Babylonian hymns, Assyrian chronicles, and even biblical stories. By expressing universal truths, the pain of loss, the pursuit of justice, the joy of creation, Sumerian literature became a touchstone for all cultures that followed. In their narratives, the human spirit first found articulation, first questioned its place in the universe, and first sought solace in shared understanding. Their songs, immortalized in clay, remind us that even as cities fall and empires vanish, the inner world of humanity, its fears, dreams, and desires, continues to resonate. And so, though Sumer's cities crumbled and their kings were forgotten, their stories endured, shaping the cultures, philosophies, though imaginations of all who followed. Every civilization believes it is eternal, until the rivers change their course. The story of Sumer, humanity's first urban culture, reminds us that no society, however innovative or powerful, escapes the cycles of creation, growth, however decline. From the earliest settlements along the fertile floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates to the majestic ziggurats of Ur and the bustling trade hubs of Uruk, Sumer rose as if guided by the hands of both gods and humans. Its innovations, writing, law, architecture, and astronomy, were unprecedented, marking the dawn of organized civilization. Yet even at the height of its glory, the seeds of vulnerability were present. The very abundance that sustained Sumer, rich alluvial soil, extensive irrigation networks, and vibrant trade routes, required careful management. Missteps in water control could, and did, lead to soil salinization and crop failure. Social tension, rivalry among city-states, and the pressures of defense against neighboring peoples created fractures in the political fabric. History shows us that success is rarely permanent. It demands constant adaptation to both environmental and social challenges. Sumer's collapse was not sudden, but a slow erosion. Internal strife, external invasions, and climatic changes converged to undermine centuries of achievement. Cities that once thrived became abandoned mounds. Temples, marketplaces, and libraries fell silent. Yet, even in decline, Sumer left behind an extraordinary legacy. Its innovations did not vanish. They were absorbed, transformed, and carried forward by Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. The cycle of rise and fall, it seems, is not only a tale of endings, but also of continuity. Reflecting on this arc offers profound insight. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, must balance ambition with sustainability, expansion with stability, and ingenuity with humility. Sumer's experience illustrates that survival depends not merely on technological skill, but on the careful stewardship of natural and human resources. The Tigris and Euphrates, once the source of life, became agents of transformation, reminding us that nature's rhythms are indifferent to human ambition. Likewise, ethical and social cohesion play a role. societies that fail to maintain justice, equity, and order risk accelerating their own decline. The Sumerian example is a mirror for every civilization that follows. Rome, Egypt, the Mayans, and even modern nations display the same patterns. Innovation sparks growth, prosperity invites complexity, and complexity requires adaptability. Lessons from Sumer are universal because they reflect the fundamental interplay between human aspiration and environmental reality. By studying their story, we glimpse the fragile balance that underpins all human achievement. Yet the cycle of history is not merely a cautionary tale. It is also a source of hope. Though Sumer fell, it shaped every society that inherited its knowledge. Its writing, laws, religious ideas, and urban concepts endured far beyond its physical presence. In this way, the fall of one civilization becomes the foundation for another, a reminder that endings can be beginnings, and that human progress is cumulative. From reflection arises a question: what does Sumer teach us today? The answer is as relevant now as it was 4,000 years ago, that innovation without stewardship is precarious, that prosperity must be balanced with foresight, and that the cycles of nature and society are inseparable from the fate of civilization itself. And so, as we look back on Sumer's rise and fall, we recognize not only the fragility of human achievement, but also its enduring power to shape the future. The first farmers once turned paradise into dust, a lesson still unlearned. In the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, Sumerian ingenuity transformed marshlands into productive fields, feeding growing populations and giving rise to cities. They built canals, levees, and irrigation networks of remarkable complexity, bringing water to crops with precision and skill. Yet in doing so, they also sowed the seeds of vulnerability. Over-irrigation, combined with the natural salinity of the soil, gradually reduced fertility, leaving once lush fields parched and unproductive. What had been a source of life slowly became a source of decay. This tension between progress and fragility defines the Sumerian experience. Each innovation, writing, governance, monumental architecture, amplified human capability, but also demanded careful stewardship. The very abundance that allowed artisans to create jewelry and scribes to fill tablets with law and literature depended upon fragile ecological balances. When these balances were disrupted, the social and political structures built atop them began to unravel. The collapse of canals and crop failures contributed to the weakening of city-states, leaving them vulnerable to invasion and internal unrest. The lesson resonates across time. The Sumerians remind us that technological mastery alone does not guarantee survival. Societies that fail to respect natural limits risk undoing the very progress they cherish. The parallels with modern life are striking. Today, we face climate change, soil depletion, water scarcity, and ecological collapse, challenges that echo the struggles of the first irrigators. Sumer's fate is not a distant story, but a cautionary reflection of our own potential missteps. Yet the fragility of progress is not merely a tale of doom. It is a meditation on balance, foresight, and humility. The Sumerians achieved brilliance precisely because they understood the interdependence of nature, labor, and governance. They demonstrated that human ingenuity can elevate society to extraordinary heights, but also that ignoring the delicate systems that sustain life can unravel even the most sophisticated civilizations. Their story teaches that true advancement is not simply measured in monuments or records, but in the sustainable integration of knowledge, environment, but social cohesion. Moreover, Sumer's struggles illuminate a profound human truth: progress is never guaranteed. It must be continually maintained, adapted, and respected. The rise and fall of Uruk and Ur were not merely the outcomes of external pressures, but also the consequences of choices, decisions made by individuals and communities about how to harness, manage, and preserve their world. In these choices, we see a mirror of every generation that follows, that our achievements, no matter how impressive, are contingent upon awareness and responsibility. The fragility of progress also underscores the value of memory. Though Sumerian cities crumbled, their innovations endured, preserved in the texts, myths, and artifacts that modern scholars unearthed. Their achievements became lessons as well as legacies, a reminder that knowledge can survive even when its creators do not. In this way, Sumer teaches both caution and hope, caution in recognizing the limits of our control, and hope in understanding that wisdom, once recorded, can guide future generations. But beyond warning, Sumer offers something more enduring: inspiration. The people of Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash achieved a civilization capable of writing, law, mathematics, and art. They dreamed, experimented, and built against the constraints of their environment. Even as their rivers shifted and their cities fell silent, the echoes of their brilliance remained, whispering across millennia. Sumer's fragility reminds us that progress is precious, yet it also shows that human creativity, when nurtured, can outlast the hands that first shaped it. And so, the lesson endures. To build with wisdom is to honor both the earth and the generations to come. A truth first learned in the clay and canals of Sumer. The rivers dried, the temples fell, but the idea of civilization never died. Even as the ziggurats of Ur crumbled into dust, and the streets of Uruk lay silent beneath the sun, the spirit of human ingenuity persisted. Sumer may have vanished from the maps of the living, but its inventions, its stories, but its vision of organized society continued to pulse through the veins of humanity. In the wake of its fall, later civilizations, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and beyond, inherited the blueprint of urban life, writing, law, and culture. This resilience speaks to a fundamental truth. Humanity has always possessed the capacity to learn from what has been lost. The collapse of Sumer was not an end, but a beginning. Its canals, tablets, and temples became sources of inspiration for those who followed. The wisdom of the first scribes guided merchants and priests in Babylon. Its myths shaped the epic narratives of later Mesopotamian literature. What the Sumerians had discovered, that human organization, memory, and imagination could transform survival into civilization, became a seed that continued to grow even in unfamiliar soils. In celebrating this endurance, we see a broader pattern: that civilization is not merely built of brick and mortar, but of ideas. Even when cities vanish, the principles they embodied, justice, scholarship, devotion, and creativity, endure. The work of one generation becomes the foundation for the next, a relay of knowledge and hope across time. Sumer's story illustrates that the flame of human achievement is remarkably tenacious. It can be dimmed by environmental shifts, political upheaval, or war, yet it can never be fully extinguished, for it resides not only in structures but in the imagination and memory of people. Sumer's influence also reminds us of the beauty that arises from adversity. The chaos of collapsed canals or abandoned cities did not erase the value of its art, literature, or law. Rather, it allowed these creations to be carried forward, interpreted, or transformed by others. Civilization, in this sense, is a continuum, each society a link in a chain extending from Ur to the present day. Human beings inherit not just technology or governance, but the collective achievements of those who came before, learning from their triumphs and their mistakes alike. Even in the silence of forgotten cities, there is a whisper of optimism. The very act of rediscovery, cuneiform deciphered, ruins unearthed, epics translated, demonstrates that memory can return and meaning can be renewed. Sumer teaches that while the material forms of civilization are fragile, the ideas themselves are remarkably resilient. Humanity rebuilds, learns, and continues to create beauty from the chaos of history, proving that no fall is ever final when knowledge endures. Thus, the story of Sumer concludes not with loss, but with hope. Its rivers may have shifted, and its temples may have crumbled, and the civilization it nurtured continues to flow through the human story. The lessons of governance, innovation, art, and morality ripple through time, shaping our cities, laws, and literature even today. And so, as the echoes of clay tablets and ziggurats fade into memory, the enduring flame of civilization remains, a quiet testament to humanity's capacity to rise again. Thus, we return to where we began, to the land between the rivers, the cradle of all that followed. A language may die, but meaning endures. The Sumerians' own tongue, once spoken in the bustling streets of Uruk and Eridu, eventually fell silent. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, it was no longer anyone's mother tongue. Yet, to call Sumerian dead would be misleading. Though it ceased to be spoken, it survived as a vessel of knowledge, a tool of scholarship, and a thread woven into the fabric of subsequent civilizations. The Akkadians, who rose to dominance across Mesopotamia, quickly recognized the power and prestige of Sumerian literacy. For centuries, scribes continued to study Sumerian texts, copying them, translating them, and annotating them in Akkadian. In this way, Sumerian became a classical language, much like Latin would be for Europe thousands of years later. Its grammar and vocabulary were preserved not for conversation, but for study, ritual, but administration. Through the careful labor of scribes, the words of the first civilization remained accessible to those who came after, providing continuity in law, literature, and religion. Babylonian libraries, often storing thousands of clay tablets, were filled with Sumerian compositions. Hymns, legal codes, and epic narratives were recopied generation after generation. Students in scribal schools learned the language as an academic exercise, practicing its complex signs and mastering its nuances. In these classrooms, Sumerian was more than a set of symbols. It was a living memory, a way of connecting with the ancient past, a bridge across centuries. Even when the spoken word had vanished, the culture encoded in language persisted, shaping ideas, religious rituals, and literary traditions. The eventual rediscovery of Sumerian in the 19th century reinforced this legacy. When scholars such as Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks deciphered cuneiform, they were unlocking voices that had been carefully preserved by generations of Mesopotamian scribes. The dead language became alive again, not as a spoken tongue, but as a tool for understanding the earliest human civilizations. Through it, we can read administrative records, prayers, myths, and poetry, glimpses into the minds of people who lived 4,000 years ago. Sumerian's influence extends beyond direct scholarship. It shaped the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian literary styles. Concepts of divine authority, law, and myth that originated in Sumerian texts became embedded in the cultural DNA of the region. Even today, through these mediated legacies, Sumerian continues to shape our understanding of governance, religion, and storytelling. Its words, though no longer heard in marketplaces or temples, resonate in the architecture of ideas, reminding us that language is never truly lost when it carries meaning. In reflecting on Sumerian, we see a paradox. Death and survival coexist. The tongue of a civilization may cease to be spoken, yet it can continue to inform, inspire, and instruct countless generations. It teaches us that human memory is not bound to the present. It flows forward, layered with centuries of careful preservation and reinterpretation. Sumerian lives on as both a subject of study and a foundation of human thought, demonstrating that meaning, once encoded, can endure far longer than sound or speech. And from meaning arises remembrance, a quiet, enduring legacy that continues to speak across millennia. We live by Sumer's rhythm, in calendars, contracts, and the quiet order of our days. Though 4 millennia have passed since the first cities rose along the Tigris and Euphrates, the legacy of Sumer pulses through the routines, institutions, and knowledge systems we often take for granted. Every written contract, every measured hour, every record of trade and law traces its lineage back to the people who first inscribed symbols into clay and organized society along principles that balanced human need with cosmic order. The gift of writing remains perhaps Sumer's most intimate inheritance. From the cuneiform tablets of Uruk to the screens on which we now type, humanity's ability to capture thought, transmit knowledge, and preserve memory owes its origins to the scribes of the first civilization. Without their innovation, libraries, schools, literature, and historical scholarship would not exist in the way we know them today. Even digital records, databases, And archival systems are distant echoes of the first efforts to record grain inventories and temple offerings, a demonstration of continuity that spans the entirety of human intellectual history. Governance and law also carry the imprint of Sumerian insight. Their codification of property rights, contracts, and social accountability created the earliest blueprint for ordered society. Modern legal systems, bureaucracies, and administrative frameworks, and far more complex, still reflect principles first articulated on clay tablets in Ur. The idea that a society must balance authority with responsibility, that contracts must be honored, and that citizens must be bound to collective norms. These were first formalized in Sumer and remain central to how civilizations organize themselves today. Even our notions of civic duty and justice owe a subtle debt to the codified wisdom of kings like Ur-Nammu and the diligent scribes who preserved societal memory. Sumerian influence extends to science and observation. Their meticulous records of lunar and solar cycles, seasonal patterns, and celestial phenomena laid the groundwork for astronomy and mathematics. The division of time into 60 minutes and 60 seconds, the 360-degree circle, and the concept of the year as a structured unit all originate from their careful study of the heavens. Modern clocks, calendars, and navigation systems all operate within frameworks Sumerians first imagined, a testament to the enduring relevance of their empirical insight. Even in culture and art, the Sumerian spirit resonates. Epic storytelling, poetry, hymns, and ritualized music, all first formalized in their cities, continue to inform literature, theater, and spiritual practice. Their capacity to explore human emotion, morality, and the natural world through narrative set a precedent for every subsequent civilization. In essence, we live not only by their structures, but by the rhythm of their imagination, which continues to shape how humanity understands itself. Every day, we move through a world still defined by Sumer's innovations, often without realizing it. From signing contracts to following calendars, from reading literature to gazing at the stars, the frameworks they created remain embedded in our lives. Civilization itself, in its complexity and endurance, is a silent tribute to the people who first built cities where none had existed, who first drew meaning from chaos, and who first attempted to order life with wisdom and foresight. As the narrative slows, the modern world feels less distant from Ur and Eridu. The inventions of Sumer are not relics of curiosity, but living threads woven into daily existence. The cities may have fallen, the language may have been silenced, and the rulers may have been forgotten, yet the Sumerian spirit, in law, writing, mathematics, and cultural imagination, flows through the continuity of human civilization. Their achievements are not merely historical, they are intimately present, quietly shaping the rhythm, order, and thought of contemporary life. And as the film nears its close, we pause to reflect. The Sumerians are not only in history books or museum halls. They live in the structure of our societies, the cadence of our time, and the enduring rhythm of human achievement. The rivers still flow, carrying the memory of the first city built by human hands. The Tigris and Euphrates, winding through the plains of modern Iraq, move with the same quiet persistence that nourished the earliest farmers and scribes of Sumer. Their waters reflect the sky as they have for thousands of years, indifferent to empires, kings, or the passage of centuries, yet silently bearing witness to the triumphs and failures of those who once called their banks home. Walking along these ancient waters, one can imagine the cities of Uruk, Ur, and Eridu rising from the marshes, their streets bustling with traders, artisans, and priests. Ziggurats soared toward the heavens, inscriptions etched into clay whispered the laws of society, and hymns echoed in temple courts. The rivers carried grain to markets, silt to fields, and stories to future generations. Though the cities themselves have vanished into sand and memory, the rhythm of the rivers preserves the continuity of life, linking the past to the present. Sumer's story is a reminder that civilizations are fragile, yet human curiosity and creativity endure. The structures may crumble, and languages may fade, and the impulse to build, to write, to organize, and to dream is eternal. Each ripple of the Tigris and Euphrates is a quiet testament to the first experiments in urban life, law, art, and knowledge. In this sense, the rivers are not merely water. They are memory itself, flowing through the landscape as a living archive of humanity's beginnings. Looking at the rivers today, one sees both continuity and change. Modern cities, roads, and cultures overlay the ancient land, yet the essence of Sumer survives in the systems we inherit, in the laws we follow, and in the stories we tell. The waters remind us that the human journey is cyclical. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, and the quest for meaning, order, and beauty persists, carried forward by each generation that walks the same earth. As the sun sets over the plains, casting golden light upon the winding rivers, we feel a sense of closure and connection. Sumer may be gone from the maps of power, yet it is alive in our understanding, in our institutions, and in the enduring patterns of civilization. The journey of humanity, begun on these fertile banks, continues, shaped by the echoes of the first city that dared to transform clay, water, and imagination into a society. And so, the journey ends where it began, in the cradle of civilization, with the rivers flowing endlessly, carrying the memory of Sumer and the enduring spirit of human endeavor. The story of the Sumerians reminds us that even the earliest civilizations shaped the course of human history in ways we still live with today. If this journey through time has sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing to our channel to explore more civilizations, their stories, and the legacies they left behind. Share your reflections in the comments below. Which invention, king, or tale captured your imagination the most? And if you wish to continue walking through the echoes of the past, explore our playlist of documentaries tracing the rise and fall of empires that followed. Together, we can keep the memory of human ingenuity alive, and perhaps carry the lessons of the past into the world we build today.